What a blessing to have all of you joining us this evening, or if you're downloading this message, we're so grateful that you're taking the time to grow in your walk of faith. I've got my lovely wife and co-host, Dr. Roxanne Lowe, who's a psychologist, and we hope and pray that today, as we do every single show, to just inspire you and guide you in your walk of faith. As always, we're broadcasting on Ancient Faith's YouTube page, as well as on the Louhs Facebook page. So feel free to leave a comment there, and always call us if you've got a question or comment, or just really want to engage the conversation. We'd love to hear from you. You can call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. And let me just begin by sharing from both of us. We wish you all the very best during this Lenten season. We pray that you will grow in your walk of faith, that you'll find areas of your life that need to get realigned with where Christ yearns for us, and that this will be a season to do just that. So hopefully the show will add to that. And tonight we're talking about really one of the very fruits that we're all called to have as Christians. And this fruit that we could talk about is kindness. And one of the things that we hear about, and many of us have talked about these, whether they be in sermons or in presentations or Bible studies, is known as the fruits of the Spirit. And we hear about that in the book of Galatians. And basically, just to kind of give you a context of this book, is St. Paul is writing to a people in Galatia who, to be quite honest with you, are very new in their Christian faith, and they're kind of wobbling, if you will, on what to do, as far as, do they kind of hold on to those external ways of living out their faith, or do they recognize that Christ is yearning for them to grow in their walk of faith, and that change really is not something that happens on the outside in, but rather on the inside out. In other words, when we start living our faith, it's a decision that we make internally that starts to show up externally, and that's why they call it the fruits of the Spirit. And one of those fruits is kindness. And I thought, what powerful way then on this very first week of Great Lent to really spend some time talking about that. Because for many of us, Roxanne, we talk about Lent and the fasting and what we're going to be, fasting from, as far as the food, the meat, the dairy products. But we oftentimes don't talk about what we're going to be feasting on. What are the things that we're going to add into our lives? And what would it look like if, as a people, we as Christians would feast on being more kind towards people?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is something that, we try to teach our kids when they're young.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that, we sort of a term that I think we throw around pretty loosely. But really, to truly be kind is not always easy. It's not always reflexive. And I think that's something that, as human beings, especially throughout Lent, this is something to really be mindful of, to have this sort of discernment within ourselves of, is this something that I struggle with?
Mm-hmm.
Truly, is this something that I struggle with? And I think we're called to really study ourselves. We talk about this a lot, where the church fathers talk quite a bit about, that level of studying ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
and knowing ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But I think too often, we sort of take something like kindness for granted, and we don't really study how often throughout the week have I truly been kind, and where have I stumbled in being kind?
And I think too, we actually keep better records of when other people are unkind towards us. We can recognize it in them, and sometimes we don't really recognize it in ourselves. But I love Mark Twain, the great poet and writer, wrote this. He said that kindness is the language which the deaf can hear and the blind can see. It's a universal language. It's a language that the deaf can hear and the blind can see. And I love that, how it impacts all of us, that all of us love it when someone goes out of their way to show an act of kindness towards us.
I was actually driving just this morning, and it's amazing how acts of kindness move us.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they have the power to completely reset us in any given moment and grab our attention in ways that are pretty tremendous. But I was pulling into a neighborhood today that had quite a bit of construction, and these guys have been out there. Well, you see it, the construction in front of the church. They've been out there for months, and it's in Florida. It's starting to get pretty hot, and so the other day I was pulling into this neighborhood this morning, and I see this woman who just stops in front of me as she's pulling into this neighborhood, and I'm thinking, why is she stopping? It's construction going on. She gets out of her car with two 24-pack containers of Gatorade, and she just starts handing it out to all the construction workers.
Wow,
and
great.
I was incredibly moved by just that raw act of kindness.
It's absolutely beautiful. And I think there's two parts of it, I think, that we want to really cover in tonight's show. And one is the kindness that we express and extend to other people. That's obviously important. But also what are the internal things that we need to do to have kindness within ourselves. And I'll explain to that later on in the show. But what I want to do is define, just at the very beginning of our show, really what is one of the definitions of kindness. And I thought this particular definition, Roxanne, really spoke to me about what kindness is. It's defined as having compassion, being sensitive, and I hone in on this word, tender-hearted. And I love that word, tender-hearted. In other words, that level of kindness is a reflection of where our heart is. In other words, how our heart is will shape our ability to be kind towards people. And one of the things that when you take back and look back at history in Christianity, and some of the things that we talk about, especially in the Orthodox Church, where you have this 2,000 years of history, is how the non-Christians, if you will, the pagans or those that had not accepted Christ, how do they recognize the early Christians? And it was interesting. I was doing some research recently, Roxanne, and I actually put this in a sermon that we gave a couple weeks ago on kindness and it was interesting that Tertullian referred to that early on the pagans would call the Christians this word. It was the word Christotes. So before they even were called Christians, according to this historian who was writing on what Tertullian commented on, that the Christians were called Christotes, which basically means people that are filled with kindness. Isn't that amazing? So before that, they were even called Christians. They were called people of kindness. And throughout the writings of the church fathers, throughout the readings of the Bible, we hear just how important it is to be kind. But let's be honest. I mean, I think for all of us this morning, that experience that you had with the lady bringing Gatorade to the workers that were working in front of our church is an amazing gift, and it reminds us of really how and who we're called to be. But the reality is that we're living in a world that is struggling, I would argue, to show kindness. I mean, sometimes, the slightest thing on the road we see where people can be impatient and unkind towards one another. I mean, how often do we hear about road rage, or how often do we hear ourselves sometimes getting upset with someone else who may have done something driving wise that may have cut us off or didn't do the right signal or whatever? Or how about the other person showing and being unkind towards us? So I thought it'd be great to kind of just share, what are some of the reasons why we can find ourselves being unkind towards people. And again, we invite you, if you've got a question or comment, or maybe you've experienced a level of kindness from someone else that you'd like to share on the air, we'd love to hear from you as well. And so one of the things that I find that in our own research that causes people to be unkind is that we are unloving. And that what I mean by this unloving is that we have forgotten to really just find the value of people in general. In other words, we forgot to see the beauty in people. We can find what we don't like about them, but really we don't look about what is so good about them. And sometimes we can see that even in relationships, in families and in marriages, where sometimes the smallest thing can create such an unkind act, unkind behavior, unkind speech. And so we're not moved by truly loving people. So I think number one, I would say is that we oftentimes see with people that are unkind is that we've lost the need to be where we're unloving.
Yeah, and I would say going back to that definition of being sensitive and tender-hearted and compassionate, I would argue that one would need to be able to recognize the emotions of others to be able to be sensitive and compassionate toward their experience. Right. And so often this is something that I think we've lost in today's world is a bit of emotional intelligence, where we're able to register the feelings of others, make sense of them, and then take it one step further to care enough about them and to be sensitive toward the experience of someone else.
I think it's so wise too. And I think, we could spend a whole show just talking about empathy and walking in people's shoes. But I do think that when we fail to have that spirit of looking at people the way God wanted us to look at them, and one of the things I oftentimes tell our church family is I say everyone matters to God, that we will never see people that do not mean something to God. And that's important to remember, because I think sometimes we can kind of live on these little islands with people that think like us or have the same beliefs that we do, and we tend to it's kind of an us versus them. And when we recognize that everyone matter to God. I mean, we hear that actually right before we begin Lent, where we hear one of the Gospels that says, "In as much as you do to the least person you know, you're doing it to me." These are the words of Christ when talking about at the day of judgment, basically what's going to happen on that day. And it's a horrifying statement that Christ is making, because in many ways it creates a mirror moment for us, that when we're saying and hearing the words of God saying that in as much as you've done to the least person you know, you're doing it to him, to doing it to me. And just think about how often we're doing that to people that we don't even think about, or who we may disregard. I think another area besides being unloving is, Roxanne, is unmerciful. And I think that's so important for all of us to remember, is that how we value people will determine how we treat people. And this is very important, especially now in our world right now, where we are seeing this level of, I think, devaluing of people, and it impacts our actions. So again, if we're talking about kindness being something that originates in the heart, that it's a tender-hearted person who does that when we have lost the fact that I'm going to value them based upon what they can benefit me, or what they're not, or what they're lacking, well, that will shape my action towards them, or how I look at them, whether I communicate with them, whether I don't, what do I say, how do I be? And so I think these are so important for us to remember, that not only is it unloving, but unmerciful, where we choose who we value. And we know that through the scriptures, again, as I was mentioning earlier, that God values us all. The Bible says that in the book of Romans, that while we were still sinning, God demonstrated his love for us by dying for us. In other words, he showed us what value we had in his eyes.
Yeah, his love wasn't conditional, and I think this is something we struggle with in kindness. One of the greatest obstacles is our own emotions get in the way of being kind, right? So it is completely, easy to be kind when kindness is present. I mean, it's a bit harder to be kind, when unkindness is present. And so I think at many times when somebody disappoints us, or somebody upsets us, or doesn't live up to our expectations, suddenly the virtue of kindness, it feels almost not in our reach, even though it was within our reach, just minutes prior. So I think oftentimes it's something that, we feel conditionally connected to, as opposed to something that we need to reach for despite somebody letting us down, hurting us, upsetting us, or otherwise.
And, just to kind of, the third area, I think, just to kind of build on what we've been talking about, being unloving and unmerciful, is, I think, just unhealthy thinking. I mean, how often do we as a people, and I think we're all guilty of this, none of us are immune from these things, that we just have unhealthy thoughts about people, or unhealthy, when we see someone that may be sitting at the side of the road, holding a sign, the unhealthy thoughts of judgment, when we are looking at people that may act a certain way, or may do something that's a little bit different than what we do, or may not be as engaged or involved in the church, or in their own walk of faith. Sometimes we can just have unhealthy thoughts towards them. So I think it's so important that we as a people recognize that if this is something that's so important, that God uses this through the pen of St. Paul, about that this is one of the fruits that appears. In other words, that when we look like him, when we are following Christ, that this is the fruit, that one of the fruits that is produced is this fruit of kindness. Then we have to know, friends, that it is on the front line of the enemy. The enemy yearns for us to be destructive towards one another, to find division. I oftentimes tell people that his mantra is very simple. It's divide and conquer. That's what his goal is. And we can see that in our world right now, the division that we see taking place. So what I thought would be great, Roxanne, is before the show, I was asking just some friends of mine to kind of write down or text me what they looked upon, what were some of the words when I said the word kindness, what are the words that they thought about, that they think were words that were synonymous with people that are kind, and see if any of these apply to you. But one of my friends mentioned that people that are kind are friendly people. In other words, that when you see them, they're just friendly. And I think all of us know people that they just make our days better. They're just always kind, always friendly. They're the type of people that when you see them, the first thing they say is good morning. They're not dwelling on what's going wrong. They really just have a very positive inward spirit. So one of my friends mentioned friendly. Another one of my classmates had mentioned that people that are kind, they exhibit generosity. And I love that. I think it's one of the definitions of the word kind is also one that's being useful to others. I love that we're actually looking for ways to make other people. So I love that. Generosity would be a way that we would look at kindness. Another person had shared with me that with kindness, it would be someone who's considerate. I think it's so, like we were mentioning earlier, Roxanne, at the top of the show, is that, for a lot of people, we spend so much time wanting to focus it on what we need and what our families desire or what time I have to deal with. And that whole idea of consideration means stepping out of me and stepping into you, looking at what I can do to kind of carry that. And then meek. I love that word. Sometimes people think that people that are meekness is a sign of weakness. But it's actually quite the contrary. It's this idea that everything I'm doing is for the other person. So we just kind of wanted to share all these different ways that kindness looks like, and how important it is for us to kind of check our heart. Because if it is a heart issue, then maybe we need to all take a moment and look at our heart and how we are operating as Christians.
And I think, as you're speaking about that, I think is just a beautiful thing to focus on throughout Lent is, how often do you think about how your presence affects others? Truly think about, how does my presence affect others? Do I tend to leave people in more light or dark?
Mm-hmm.
Do I tend to bring comfort or more stress? Do I help ease pain or do I often create it?
Mm-hmm.
Am I bestowing encouragement or finding flaws, in people? Am I problem solving or problem calling? I mean, I could go on, but, these are moments where, self-awareness is so important because we talk about kindness, but really how much are we in an experiential way, living this out, not in all the moments where it's easy, but in the moments where, I might be more stressed, I might be more disappointed, again, and where kindness is not always reflexive, or where I could just kind of be caught up in my own world, but I'm trying to actually see others and their own experience. And this is really the moment where we share light and can bring light into dark spaces. And this is what's so brilliant about the Holy Spirit. I mean, it was designed, for us to sort of bring light into all those dark spaces because you can't really see light in light.
Exactly. And I think too, as we're ushering in this very first week of Lent, St. John Chrysostom says this extraordinary quote, because I think as we were mentioning earlier, I think for a lot of people, and it's a tendency that we can all run into, is where we can look at fasting, especially during this Lent, is what am I going to be giving up? And what we oftentimes talk about on the show, as well as in our ministry, is that, Lent is not about what you're fasting from only, it's about what you're going to be feasting on. And St. John Chrysostom said this with regards to Lent. He said that we can be people that fast from meat and dairy products, fast from the items that we eat, but yet devour our brothers and sisters by the way in which we treat them. So here he was trying to share with us the importance of that you could have all the fasting you want, but if you don't have that kindness or that love, it means really nothing. And the scriptures talk about that. The book of Corinthians says, without love, I mean, we're basically just a loud clanging cymbal that has no power behind it. So again, if this is a fruit that we're supposed to be producing, and especially during this season of Great Lent, where we're really trying to realign our life with Christ, the questions that we're asking is, what would it look like if today I put on the things that I want to feast on, being more kind to the people that are in my life, being more kind to my family and those that are close around me. I think too, Roxanne, and just before I wanted to acknowledge, we've got a lot of people already on our listening on YouTube. So thanks to Cloud Dragon Arts for your comment, as well as Empty Nester. Welcome from Nebraska. Glad that you guys are all joining us this evening as well. And to all of you that are there, welcome as well. But, I think the key for us is if we recognize that, like, Lord, I want to help to be a person of kindness during the season of Lent, and obviously take it beyond that, what are some things that I think that we can all do today? So I thought the first part of this, Roxanne, you and I could share with our listeners and our viewers What are some things that we can do to extend forgiveness towards other people? And then the second part of the show is I really want to spend some time talking about how do we avoid being unkind towards people. So we're kind of doing this a little bit backwards, but because I first wanted to kind of share what does it look like when we are kind towards people, and then on the second half, kind of providing ways that we can protect ourselves from being unkind towards other people. And again, we'd love to hear from you. Call us at 1-855-237-2346 if you've got a question or a comment, or leave a comment on our YouTube page. And thanks to all of you that are chiming in. Thanks, Tariq, so much for your comment as well. And God willing, we'll get to all those questions and comments. So here's number one. I thought if we were going to be people during this Lenten season that would start feasting on kindness, what would it look like? And I think number one, we would say is that we show mercy to those who disappoint us. I mean, how often do we find people that can just simply disappoint us? And, one of the things I think that we oftentimes share is that one of the biggest reasons why conflict happens is in the expectations. So you look at your own relationships that you're in, and even in our relationship, sometimes the things that we may argue about are in the expectations. We expect something to happen and it doesn't happen, and sometimes it creates conflict. And that's okay, but oftentimes what ends up happening is that instead of us turning that from that expectation into mercy or compassion or kindness, as we've been talking about, we can actually turn it into judgment, unforgiveness, anger, resentfulness. And so I think it's so important, Roxanne, that we recognize that if we want to start producing this fruit of kindness, that we need to recognize that people are going to disappoint us, and that's okay.
And St. Paul gives us a pretty good description of how to respond. In the book of Ephesians, he says, get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words, and slander, as well as all types of evil behavior, and instead be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as God through Christ has forgiven us. And I love the juxtapose of kindness and tender-hearted with all of those, what he deems as evil behaviors, bitterness and rage. And I think, and again, it really does begin at the moment of our thoughts, right? Where our words are not going to be kind if our heart has been in a very unkind place and we've allowed bitter roots to take root, bitter seeds to take root and to begin to grow. And we often nourish, very what I would call unhealthy, negative, and hurtful and judgmental and pretty righteous thoughts at times when people disappoint us. And when that is allowed to grow in a heart, unfortunately, the words that come are not going to be kind. That will not be the fruit of that seed. Right.
And, just kind of building what you were saying, and thanks to Sandra from Western North Carolina. I'm glad that you're with us, and Benjamin and Tariq, all of you guys that are writing in our YouTube page. Love having you with us. But just to kind of build on what you were sharing, Roxanne, is that the book of Colossians says this: therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies and kindness. So here, the church, through the pen of St. Paul, who writes the book of Colossians, you all know that, is basically saying, hey, listen, if you are part of the elect, which means that you are people that are following God, then this is what it looks like, that there is a level of tender mercy, that tenderheartedness, that kindness. And the scriptures talk about that they will know that you are my disciples by the way in which we treat one another, by the way in which we show that love, that kindness. And let's be real. I mean, as we mentioned earlier, I think it's normal that you're going to have disappointments. People are going to disappoint you, sometimes that are close to you, and sometimes those are people that you may work with, sometimes even when you're you go to the grocery store and someone's you expected to have to get a buy one get one free, and they don't have the product there that you were going to get, and those things like that happen. The key, though, for us is recognizing that sometimes when we are when people disappoint us, we can try to want to put them on our potter's wheel, where we try to maneuver them and try to change them and try to adjust them. And I'm not telling you not to be able to be open and honest about what your needs are. You have to share that. That's extremely important. We do that in our own family. We, in fact, recently, Roxanne and I sat down with our children, and we made a list of the things that we want to be known for as a family, not necessarily outside of our family, but what's the fruits of the Lowe family? And we talked about this. In fact, one of them is on kindness, and one of them is being present when we're all together. It's giving someone the benefit of the doubt. We kind of put together a whole bunch of these things. Maybe we can post it on our Lowe's Facebook page. But the point I'm making is that at the end of the day is that since we are doing that, and that we are allowing everyone to kind of be themselves, but recognizing that these are the core tenets of what we're going to believe in. So have those convictions, but it shouldn't come at the cost of being disrespectful or unkind to someone else. And I think that's where we find ourselves sometimes teetering on, is that when someone does disappoint us, we can go from disappointment to unkindness rather quickly.
Absolutely. And, I think when we're really looking at how does kindness play out, what is that supposed to look like? In successful relationships, I would deem ones that are, kind is flourishes in these relationships. And these are people who, tend to be easy to be with individuals. I think successful relationships, who exhibit kindness, they have several things in common, in terms of how kindness is expressed. And luck is not one of them. I would say that, they have kind responses that bring moments of difficulty back to neutral. So they don't tend to fuel or escalate negativity, but they have that sort of sense of, in kindness, sort of lifting the fallen and sort of helping that person, who has sinned or who has fallen short. We're called to lift them up in gentle ways. And so they sort of have responses that bring difficult moments back to neutral. And I think that their words, when kindness is present, the words always communicate compromise and respect, mutual respect, even though you're different than me, even though I don't like what you're saying, I don't like that boundary, I don't like that need, I don't like that request, but the words still communicate compromise and respect. And I think also when I see kindness presence, I see relationships where there's sort of this accepting of influence from each other, rather than rigidly adhering to their own ideas, in sort of very positional and divided stances. And they also do this really interesting thing where they make generous interpretations instead of judgmental ones, right? In all those moments where you see kindness lived, they're just generous in the way they see things. And they're more willing to overlook faults, instead of vilifying that person in their mind.
Well, that goes to what one of our writers on our YouTube page is saying. And thanks, Juliana, for sharing this. It says that, I don't like how much I hold grudges and I think that for a lot of us,
so much.
That's so easy to do when the heart is not in the right place. We can be unkind. We can hold those grudges. I think so much of what we're talking about with people that disappoint us is really this key fruit that we talk about during this Lenten season, and that is forgiveness. I love how C.S. Lewis says, to be a Christian is to forgive the inexcusable in others because Christ first forgave the inexcusable in us. And so I think it's so important that for us as we're journeying through this season of Lent is to also recognize that, again, going back to what we said earlier, is that this is a spiritual battle. I mean, sometimes we kind of dismiss or water down kindness because we hear it so often, but it's something that the church spoke about. Christ, through the pen of St. Paul, talks about being kind. He says at the day of judgment that in as much as you do to the least person, you're doing it to me. And so because it's so valued by God as a fruit of our faith, it is also going to be on the crosshairs of the enemy against us. And I think that's why holding on to grudges, holding on to unforgiveness are definitely areas that stifle our own ability to really embrace this Lenten season, but also to experience a whole new level of freedom in our walk of faith and a closeness to Christ, because we're holding on to things that God never intended us to hold on to.
Yeah. And I think, listen, those are just moments that, anything that distracts us and sort of shifts us off course and doesn't leave us at peace is something worthy of our diving in and trying to unpack, and we can talk about grudges in the second half of the show. I think they're quite common, most people, if you were to ask, hey, is there something that you have held a long grudge about, even if they've never spoken about it, I think many people could say, yeah, I've still thought about something something, 5 or 10 years ago or last week or, 5 months ago that kind of, irked me. And I think sometimes we really struggle as human beings to kind of delve into it and unpack it enough to heal from it. And we get stuck at the surface level of what upset us, without trying to understand who we were, what it meant to us, why it meant something to us, and really, trying to look at the person underneath the offense with a sense of mutual giving and a foundation of mercy, because there's still a good inside. There's still...
I love Roxanne when you talk about this this question and that is, what is the most generous interpretation I can have of what just happened?
Yeah, and I think I've got to reference Dr. Becky Kennedy for that. She titled it "The Most Generous Interpretation."
I think that's so wise. I mean, and maybe before the break we can just kind of talk a little bit about that, because I think it's so important that when someone does things that offend us, that are unkind to us, it is having that trained thought process where we say, okay, what is the most generous interpretation I can have of why this person just did this? Because we're already interpreting what it is. We're already the judge, the jury, and everything else that goes along with it. But that statement of just simply saying, well, what is the most generous interpretation I can have of what they did?
Absolutely.
And it really forces us to kind of think outside of it, kind of gets us back in line with realignment with Christ.
Yeah, and really without invalidating our emotion in the moment. And I think that's something that we don't want to do. We want to acknowledge our emotion. Sometimes we try to talk ourselves out of an emotion, or we shouldn't feel this way. That doesn't help. That just builds up this sort of pressure to move on from a feeling, as opposed to delving into it, acknowledging the upset or the hurt, but trying to make a more generous interpretation of why it happened. And the belief and the underlying assumption is in doing that is that most people, all people, I would argue, are good inside. Maybe they didn't have our same upbringing. Maybe the context that they learned to love or learned to communicate was not the context we learned to love or communicate in.
Exactly.
And I think that so profoundly affects an individual's ability to have the resources they need to navigate well within relationship. And so, when we find ourselves in that place of judgment and that place of, really righteous anger, that more generous interpretation sort of softens our hearts and allows us to align not only with our emotion, but with the experience of the other person, bringing us a little bit more toward the middle. And really existing on that foundation of mercy.
I love that. The chat room is filled with people, so thank you so much to Benjamin for your comment, and I agree with you. He makes a comment about the forgiveness vespers. Thanks to Juliana. We're going to take a quick break. Please continue to keep adding comments to our to the YouTube Ancient Faiths YouTube page. We'd love to get to those. If you have questions as well, we'll love to try to get to them in the show. We're going to take a quick break. On the other side of this break, we're going to spend some additional points that we want to share with you, that not only about how do we produce this fruit of mercy and kindness to those who disappoint us, but the next one is going to be, how do we deal with people that are different than us and who make us upset? Stay right with us.
During his darkest moments on the cross, Jesus uttered 7 statements. His words offer us principles to live by, lessons of hope, peace, and comfort. I'm Dr. Roxanne Lowe.
And I'm Father Nicholas Lowe.
And our new book, 6 Hours, 7 Lessons, is all about how Christ's light transcends our darkness.
Christ's final words have the power to bring us into the light of his love and protection, providing wisdom and direction to follow when we face our own dark seasons. Get your copy today by going to store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com. Well, welcome back, everyone, to Live with the Louhs. We're so grateful that you're joining us tonight, or if you're downloading this podcast, thanks so much for growing in your walk of faith and finding the Louhs to be one of the sources that you do just that. We also want to take this opportunity to just invite you to join the conversation tonight. We're spending an entire show talking about the fruit of kindness. What a great way during this Lenten season to look at what are the things that we're going to be feasting on? What are the things that we're going to be adding on? Not just about what we're going to take away, but what are the things that we're going to add on to our walk of faith? And what would it look like if we started adding more of God's kindness in a world that I think is struggling for that? If you've got a question or comment, you can also call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. Or you can also leave a comment, as many people are already doing, leaving comments on Ancient Faith's YouTube page. And thank you again to all of you that are there. Tarek, Benjamin, Juliana, thanks so much for being part of our Ancient Faith's YouTube page. So we talked first of all about producing the fruit of mercy to those who disappoint us. And I thought, in addition to that, is how would it look like for us as a people during this Lenten season to produce the fruit of kindness to those who are different than us? And I don't know about you, Roxanne, but I don't know if you see this with your clients. I know sometimes I see this even in our church, and even when we travel and do retreats all over the country. What we're seeing is, at the end of the day, there is so much of us, so much of what we are is alike, but how the world loves to divide us, pitting us against the other. We see that in the political realm. We see that even in families. We see that even with school, with our children. And I don't know, we know what the enemy's mantra is. He simply says that I am here to divide and conquer. That's what his yearns to do. But just how much when people are different than us, that instead of us seeing that or valuing that or just embracing that, we can actually become unkind towards those people. And I was remembering how, the life of many of the saints who were people of faith, obviously people that loved God, but they lived during times. I was thinking about Saint Polycarp, who was a disciple of Saint John the Divine, Saint John the theologian, and here he is. He's being told to renounce his faith, or be persecuted or killed. And his response was so beautiful, and I actually wrote it down. He says this. He says, "How could I curse my blessed King and Savior?" He's talking, so he's basically given an opportunity to renounce his belief in Jesus Christ. He says, "How can I do that? If you imagine for a moment that I would do that, then I think you pretend that you know that you don't know truly who I am." And then he says this amazing statement. He says, "Hear me plainly. I am a Christian." And I love that, knowing what was going to happen. And so here we find this division that's trying to take place. We see that these people were trying to tell them to separate themselves from believing in God, knowing that they were going to be persecuted. And yet he says, "Hear me plainly, I am a Christian." And we know, just even in the scriptures, what is the very first statement that the devil speaks about in the Bible? I mean, because we do quote him in the Bible. He's quoting the Bible, asking Adam and Eve this statement. He says, "Did God really say that?" In other words, he was sowing seeds of division to people that are different than us. And so my whole idea for us as Christians and as people of faith is being mindful that people are different, but that difference does not need to come at the expense of us being kind towards them.
And I think it is definitely easier to be kind. I think it supports our mission and of the experience of kindness when we draw near to the stories of others whom we deem different. Just the other day, as we were watching the Oscars, we were watching a documentary that was winning awards, and it was the merging of two opposing forces and countries in this world.
A Palestinian and an Israeli. And the movie was called No Other Land.
Exactly. And they were both directors co-producing this story, and they had the most beautiful words of wisdom to share to such a divided world.
Because they too are in the eyes of the world divided. They have a Palestinian and a Jew who are both directing a film together, and they're working together.
And he said, if we can be, free, you can be safe. If you can be safe, we can be free. And it's like this beautiful merging of like understanding each other's stories enough to recognize the need to say, this can happen if this can happen. That only comes from, as I was reading deeper into their stories, they learned about each other's worlds. And that is what led to this sort of beautiful coming together in unity to celebrate something, just beautiful in a world that's so divided. And so again, the more we step into the world of somebody that we were judging, the easier it is to extend kindness more reflexively, because we can begin to develop an empathy, and we can see that we're more similar than we are different.
Absolutely. So we've identified that when we produce that fruit, we produce the fruit when people disappoint us. So we're hoping that and praying that these are going to be the things that are going to help you, because these things will happen to you, so that when people disappoint you, you can produce the fruit of kindness, knowing that God says that that we should extend as His elect the same tender mercy that He showed to all of us. And then not only to people that disappoint us, but to show and produce that fruit to people that are different than us, that we see, that we recognize that God's breath is in every single one of us. And then I think that the third area, Roxanne, I think is so important for all of us to remember, is that everyone has something to offer. So we show kindness, recognizing that everyone has something to offer. And I think for a lot of us, we look at our life and we look at our faith, and we sometimes think that what we know is all that we need to know, or we just center ourselves around people that are like us. But the reality is that if you're around people that think differently, I mean, and using that example of this extraordinary movie with this Palestinian and Jewish director speaking about this, and we haven't seen the movie to know fully the full capacity of this movie, but the idea that these two people saw past and recognized that each of them has something to offer the other person. And what would it look like to live in a world where we would see and recognize that everyone has something to offer? I love this quote that says that you will never meet people that do not matter to God.
And that's so beautiful, because again, what is our response? We're really supposed to help support people on this sort of road to salvation, either to be a witness to them, to inspire them, to be a mirror of accountability that inspires something better within them, but to help support their ability to kind of get back on track, right? When we add to unkindness, or we add to the disdain, it just makes that person so validated and justified, and they go even further down the road away from salvation. So, again, everybody matters to God. And I think when we start to remember that, hey, I play a role here in supporting this individual who's right in front of me. He matters to God. She matters to God. I want to help. I want to be a witness. I want to inspire them back to good.
Yeah, as you're speaking, I couldn't help but think about what St. John, I think it's St. John Chrysostom, says, that there's nothing colder than a Christian who does not care. And so the idea that we care about one another. And so again, if we're trying to produce this during this Lenten season, things that we can feast on, we could spend a whole seminar on this topic, but we would encourage you that we show kindness to people that disappoint us, people that are different than us, and recognizing that everyone has something to offer. So with that being said, I thought the tail end of our show, Roxanne, would be great to say, how do we protect ourselves from expressing unkindness? How do we get to that heart issue that we were talking about earlier? How do we recognize when our heart is not in the right place that it needs to be in order to express that mercy, that kindness that we've been talking about? And one of the things I think is that are one of the areas that I think oftentimes produces this level of unkindness is when we have a heart that is ungrateful, when we fail to kind of just enjoy the gift of today, when nothing moves us anymore, when we don't see the beauty, the sun rising and saying, wow, glory to God, this is a new day. When I don't see the beauty of that, and obviously seeing you and our children, when all that becomes taken for granted, that unkindness can grow with an ungrateful heart.
And, as you're talking about that, and I know if anybody is sitting there going, oh man, like, I wasn't appreciative of the sun this morning, or I didn't look at my wife and kids or think, I'm grateful for them. I think so often one of the things that undermines, one of the variables that undermines our ability to show that gratitude is unmanaged stress and negativity that starts to circulate within us and derail our soul's ability to feel positive emotions. I would say when you're lacking in positive emotions, it may very well mean that you are operating beyond your capacity, and your soul is screaming out, through all the signs your body gives you that you're swimming around in negativity. You can't see anything good. You're not sleeping. You're unhappy. You have critical narratives toward other people. People don't realize that's not your soul that's, impoverished. That's your soul just saying, hey, I can't really like do the thing I'm supposed to do because you're not honoring this sort of flesh that I live in. And I think so often we don't do enough life-giving behaviors when we're in modes like that. We just sort of, kind of delve down into it, or we get mad at ourselves and start beating up on ourselves instead of recognizing that we need some renewal in order to reset our souls back to be able to be where they're supposed to be.
Right. And I think going back to this idea that when we're unthankful or ungrateful, it goes to what you're saying, that if that spirit on the inside of us is looking through a negative or a dark lens, then everything will. It's like the old adage that, wherever's down in the well will always come out in the eyes, will always come out in the mouth, whatever will come out in our thoughts. So training, recognizing that, am I living with a grateful spirit? And I think for so many people, Roxanne, we can focus so much on what we want as opposed to what we have. And when we live a life going, God, I wish I had this and I wish I had that, well, a spirit of unkindness comes in there, and the enemy loves that because we're focused so much on what we don't have as opposed to what we do. And there's a level of just kind of unkindness because I think comparison gets into that, resentfulness can get into that, and can cause us to kind of lose our way.
Right. So, when we're taking care of ourselves, we see a little bit less of that, right? We don't compare quite as much, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I always like to say that when self-care is working as it should, you start to see more of God and less of you. Because the Holy Spirit, is just so ever present within you. So you yield to things like love and joy and gratitude and forgiveness and mercy. And I'm so grateful for who I am. I'm less concerned with who you are and what I don't have. I'm more aware of what I do have. And so, again, that is the source, that is the point of self-care, is so that our stress doesn't overwhelm us to the point where we aren't yielding to the Holy Spirit. We start to see a lot more of our flesh and less of the Holy Spirit.
I love that. I'm just looking at our YouTube, Ancient Faith's YouTube page, and thanks to Juliana, I definitely agree with you with what you were saying earlier, that it amazes me in early church when martyrs were getting horribly killed, they didn't blame or curse the people killing them. But in your case, you were sharing how, it oftentimes can be very difficult for us. And it brings to mind how we just celebrated this recently at the Coptic Church. They celebrated these 20 martyrs that were brought onto the beaches in Libya, and each of them was killed for their faith. And I shouldn't say killed; they were just slaughtered. They were murdered by ISIS or one of their offshoots. And it's amazing how every one of them was given an opportunity to deny their faith and to proclaim their allegiance to their God, and yet every one of them to a T was sitting there saying that, no, I believe in Jesus Christ, our God, and would be killed. And each of the people would watch as the other person, after they made that proclamation, would be beheaded. They could have easily at any point said, okay, I've got a family at home, and all these people, many of them were married, they had children. They could have easily said, you know what, I've got a family, I got to take care of things. I'm the breadwinner. I mean, you name it, they could have thought. And yet their fervor for God was so great. And when the last person, the tradition is that when a young man from Ghana who was working with him saw the faith of these men, he says, basically, I don't know, I didn't have a faith before, but seeing these men die for their faith, I want to believe in that God, referring to believing in Jesus Christ, and they obviously killed him. But it just shows you the power of when we recognize that every day we have is a blessing. When we go around with a grateful spirit, when we recognize that, there are people in our world who would love to have the problems that we have. That's how much. So when you have that, then you're much more willing to extend that level of kindness. There was this book that came out called The Progress Paradox. And basically what it found, friends, was that the more that we have, the unhappier we become, and I think that's, or the less grateful we become. And so I think that for us is just, if we're wanting to kind of protect our heart, if we're watching over our heart, we're doing a heart checkup, is make sure that we have a grateful heart to protect us. I think another area too, I don't know if you want to add anything to that as well.
Well, I was just going to sort of talk about, the steps we might need to address when when unkindness is present, or when somebody does something that angers us.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's talk about that.
I mean, how do we maintain our kindness? Because it certainly is not reflexive. And I would hate for anyone listening to this to think, man, like, why? I mean, if I try to be faithful and I try to pray and I try to yield to the Holy Spirit, why do I feel unkind at times? And it's just because you're human. One of the things I would say is, the next time you get angry, to really take a step back and ask yourself, if this can be overlooked. I think so often we tend to want to, confront things that can be overlooked. And then if we don't see it as something that could be overlooked, we confront it with blame, and we confront it, with hostility and in ways that leave other people feeling attacked. And so this doesn't do anything to sort of mend or heal or help us instill or inspire kindness in anybody else. And so if there's anything I think we have to do, I tend to think of upset in three pockets. One is, who am I in this situation? Like, what did I bring to this experience? In my own, humility, is there anything that I think, I've done to contribute to this moment? Anything from my own past that made this, more triggering or more upsetting for me than it should have been? Did I walk into the door already stressed before this situation happened? Was I upset about something from last week when this thing happened with this person, right? And so I think so often, in humility, I have to consider what role I play, before I ever begin sort of chastising somebody else for something else. And then I think in the role of humility, it's sort of considering to level the playing field for a moment. Have I not also done something that has upset someone else or been hurtful to someone else? Of course I have, right? So who am I to judge in this moment when somebody's upset me? So I think that first pocket is sort of examining ourselves, what we bring to this and what we've also done that contributes to being unkind at times, so we're less judgmental. And then the other pocket really is, who is the other person? Like, can I still see their goodness underneath what they just did? Like, who are they? What do I know about their heart outside this moment? Right. And that's not something we always do when we're judging somebody for what they've done in a moment that's about to give birth to unkind behavior. We're not going, hey, is there goodness inside? What do I know about that person's heart? Like, truly. And that's where we're trying to make that more generous interpretation of why they may have done what they did. Okay. It's like giving the benefit of the doubt moment. And the third piece I would say is the situation itself. Like, I think we have to examine why we did get upset. It's something we need to unpack. We need to ask ourselves, okay, when this happened, what did I feel? What did I need? Right. I got angry because I took it to mean what, right? How did I describe it in my mind? And what was the thing I was deeply yearning for? That I didn't have? Like, what was the value beneath it? And I think in the future, what would I be asking for? Is there even a request here that I can make? So I think in unpacking that hurt, we're also, rather than describing somebody else and who they are and how bad they are and what they've done, we're actually describing ourselves and what we would have needed. And that approach really softens our heart towards someone else, and it prevents us really from vilifying somebody else.
I love that, Roxanne. That's very, very good stuff. I think that kind of brings us to our last area that I think that, in addition to being ungrateful or just unthankful, but is being unholy. When we start allowing our lives to allow what's on the inside, the struggles that we have, to impact our ability to be kind towards people, and that unholiness can come from, as you're mentioning, the way in which the lens by which we see them, maybe the way in which we look at ourselves and how we project that on other people. It also could be that when we feel ourselves distant from God, we start treating people. It has a cascading effect on other people, and I think it's one of those things that I think that as Christians we need to always recognize. When we find ourselves really sharing that level of unkindness or resentfulness or unforgiveness, is where is God in that? Do we find ourselves distancing ourselves from God? Because the enemy will always speak the loudest when we are the loneliest. In other words, when we find ourselves away from God is when the enemy begins to work more in our life. And so I think the challenge that we all need to work on is reminding that we are called to be holy, that we're in this world, but we're not of this world, that God has separated us and he yearns for us. As we mentioned earlier for the book of Colossians, this idea of us being part of his elect. In the divine liturgy at the end, after we take communion, it says, save, O God, these your people, and bless your inheritance, that we are the inheritance of this grace that God has given us. And so I think that it's so important to look at ourselves inwardly as we study ourselves and find out, are we distant? Do we find ourselves far from God when we look at ourselves and what we're doing as far as unforgiveness, unkindness?
Yeah, and I think one of the greatest gifts we have of discernment in knowing how far we are from God is to sort of examine where our thinking is, because, kindness in our words begins with kindness in our thoughts, and kindness in our thoughts flows out of a giving and humble heart that seeks goodness. Not only my goodness, but the goodness of others, and the goodness of relationship, and the goodness of this world, the goodness of my community, the goodness of strangers. So it flows from a heart that's loving and focused toward goodness. And so I think, again, but that whole layer of like the part we can see, because we can't see our heart, but we can see the way that we're thinking. And when our thinking lacks goodness and mercy, and it's unkind, that's a heart that says, draw near to God, right? That's the body screaming the soul needs to draw near.
So I think it's ungrateful, unholy, unloving. I think when we have those uns, if you will, when we're an unloving people, when we look at when we don't love who God has made us and what our purpose is, when we allow ourselves to not extend that loving kindness towards other people, when our relationship with God is not as strong as it needs to be. I mean, at the end of the day, friends, you're never going to be able to give what you don't have. So if you're not connected to the author of love, our Savior, then obviously that has that horizontal impact in the way in which we treat other people.
And if love is coloring our perceptions, how is love defined? Let's remember 1 Corinthians, love is patient, love is kind. It is defined as kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. Okay? It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrong. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. And I think as we listen to that definition of love, and love is kind, love was never designed to stop at a feeling that we experience deep down on the inside that cannot be seen by others. It was never meant to be expressed conditionally. So it's called to just color our perceptions and give birth to our words, right? And so if it can't be seen by others, what is it really? It's just a feeling we're hoping to have, right? And so that kindness is not meant to be something that we experience conditionally, and it's not something we're supposed to express conditionally, but something that we're supposed to color our perceptions by. And everything that we think should be filtered through that lens of love.
It's interesting. As we close out the show, I do want to share just a few moments because it directly impacts what we've been talking about. And that is, this Sunday, the very first Sunday of Lent, is the Sunday of Orthodoxy, in which we process around in this extraordinary, triumphal procession of icons, each person holding their icons. It's an idea that grew out of a time in a dark period of our church history, in which there was a time in which icons were forbidden to be in churches. And we in the Orthodox Church have this triumphal reinstatement, if you will, of icons in the church, because not only do they remind us of the saints, what they experienced, who they were, that they're people like us who chose God, who lived a life dedicated to God. In many ways, they're there to give us windows, as is said oftentimes, windows to our potential. They show us who we could be living a life for Christ. But it is also not just about the saints that we're seeing and the lives that we're reading about. In the icons, we're also looking at the people that are icons, that are living icons, that are sitting in our pews. And that every single person, as we've been talking about in this show, is an icon that's made in the image and likeness of Jesus Christ, our God. And because of that, when we process this weekend with those icons, let us not just simply memorialize an event that happened 1,000 years ago, which was a triumphal event, don't get me wrong. But what about what it means for us today? How do we take those icons to inspire us, to guide us, to live out our faith by seeing these saints, studying them, but also looking at the people that are with us in this world, who we see in the flesh, and treating them accordingly, like the icons that God has created them to be. And I think if we do that, Roxanne, I think those fruits of the spirit of kindness will begin to produce more. And when we look at our lives during the season of Great Lent and moving forward, to be quite honest with you, that we will look at the things that we feasted on, and God willing, one of those will be kindness towards one another. I want to thank all of you for being here. I know Roxanne and I love having this show. We've been doing this, I think, for around 5 years now, I think.
Quite some time.
And we're so grateful for all of you taking the time to be with us. And if you're downloading this message, this podcast, do us a favor. If you find it beneficial, share it with your friends and family. I'm going to be in Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church this Friday and Saturday, which is in Charleston, South Carolina. So if you live in the Charleston, South Carolina area, come out there and see us. We're doing a retreat on our brand new book, 6 Hours, 7 Lessons, How Christ's Light Transcends Our Darkness. We want to thank Matushka Trudy and all the great people at Ancient Faith for producing this show. And we look forward to seeing all of you next Tuesday on our brand new Live with the Louhs. God bless you and stay strong in your faith.
Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne are the authors of their books Renewing You, A Priest, a Psychologist, and a Plan, and 6 Hours, 7 Lessons, How Christ's Light Transcends Our Darkness, which can be purchased at store.ancientfaith.com. Their daily inspirational messages can be found at thelouhs.com/subscribe. Be sure also to search for The Louhs on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Live with the Louhs is a listener-supported presentation of